We started Nature League to explore the amazingness of life on Earth. Over the past year, we've explored a ton of different topics, formats, and themes, and had a lot of fun along the way. During our 5th month, we explored the theme of adaptations. It began with a lesson plan about the types of adaptations we see on Earth, including some of my personal favorites. An adaptation can be defined as an inherited characteristic that maintains or increases the fitness of an organism in its specific environment. The how of adaptations has to do with natural selection and evolution, and that topic deserves its own month. However, adaptation and evolution are inseparable, so in this lesson plan, we'll discuss adaptations that have come to be through the process of natural selection. In looking through his original observations, Charles Darwin found that certain behavioral and physical adaptations of organisms to different environments were possibly linked to the origins of new species. For Darwin, explaining the adaptations he saw on the Galapagos Islands in the 1830s meant understanding the process of evolution, or change over time. Adaptations can generally be categorized as behavioral or physical. Behavioral adaptations are things that an organism evolves or learns to do to survive in its environment, whereas physical adaptations are beneficial physical characteristics. There are an unbelievable amount of adaptations on Earth, but the most common ones can generally be grouped into categories like movement, feeding, temperature regulation, camouflage, mimicry, hibernation, and predator-prey dynamics. Let's check out the first of these. Movement is a pretty big deal in terms of surviving within an environment, especially in the animal kingdom. Think about birds. The evolution of flight involved a lot of different physical adaptations. First off, having a wing with feathers instead of an arm with skin has a lot to do with improved flight ability. Bird bones themselves are an adaptation that aids in flight. They're actually hollow and super lightweight. Along those same lines, birds lay eggs to reduce the weight of carrying young, which allows easier flight. But flight is just one way of moving. The sleek body plan of fish, as well as fins, are adaptations that allow them to successfully swim. What about feeding? This category of adaptations can include both physical and behavioral examples. In general, being a carnivore or herbivore is a behavior. It's something an organism does. But there are a bunch of different physical adaptations that come along with having a certain diet or feeding behavior. Just look at teeth. Sharpened canines and flattened molars are everyday physical adaptations that facilitate behavioral adaptations like diet type. Alright, so you can probably see where this is going. Every living thing is made up of a combination of adaptations that allow it to survive in its environment, and we couldn't possibly cover all of the different types in one episode. That's why we'll keep exploring these throughout this month. With this in mind, I'd like to spend the last portion of this lesson plan sharing some of my personal favorite physical and behavioral adaptations of life on Earth. When it comes to movement, one of my favorite adaptations is something called phototaxis. That word means moving in response to light. Check out this time-lapse video of tomato plants showing this adaptive behavior over the course of a few hours. In terms of feeding, there are definitely some cool adaptations out there. One I really like is seen in giant tube worms of the deep sea. They don't have an actual digestive tract. Instead, these worms get an assist from internal bacteria that convert the hydrogen sulfide in the deep sea environment into a usable form of energy. Totally wild. Adaptations of prey species that allow them to avoid being eaten are some of the most creative. You basically think of the most sophisticated, bizarre military defense technology, but on a living being. Here are some of my favorites. Texas horned toads spit blood out of their eyes. Sea cumbers throw internal toxin and organs outside of their body. Some amphibians use their own bones as weapons by breaking them through their skin. The Hawaiian boxer crab actually grabs venomous sea anemones in its claws like danger pom-poms, waving away predators and even making contact. And sometimes the best defense is invisibility. Adaptations like camouflage and mimicry allow species like the mimic octopus to make itself look like up to 15 different species. Now, the awesome adaptations we just covered are only my personal favorites. I challenge you to find your own favorites or learn about new ones. The different ways that species on Earth have managed to persist, survive, and thrive is truly amazing, and we're excited to explore this theme more in the coming weeks. For our Adaptations Month, we had the pleasure of collaborating with Animal Wonders Montana for an adaptation-themed field trip. While there, we explored some adaptive defensive strategies from across the animal kingdom. On this field trip, we have a special guide that's going to lead us through. I am here with Jessie right now.
Hi guys, I'm Jessie. I'm the director of Animal Wonders. I like to do a lot of teaching with animals, and adaptations is my favorite topic. And what I tell the kids, a very simple description of it, is something an animal has or does that helps them survive.
Having it or doing it, it's neat to think about things that are physical and things that are behavioral.
Yes, yeah, the hidden ones are some of my favorites to share.
A lot of the adaptations we see with life on Earth are all about defensive tactics.
Right, and those are sometimes like the most obvious ones as well.
We're gonna actually see several individuals today, right? We're gonna get
yes.
few different taxonomic groups, so that's how we categorize different life on Earth.
You guys are gonna see everything from mammals to birds to reptiles, amphibians, and invertebrates.
Let's do it.
Let's go.
We are going to check out the adaptations for the group that is reptiles.
Meet Blueberry, the blue-tongued skink. A skink is a kind of a lizard. Generally, they have a shorter, thicker neck, long body, and little legs. So she has this blue tongue. It is actually a warning color, so she's mimicking animals that actually put a lot of effort into creating a poison or a toxin. So when an animal comes close, they're like, nope, warning colors, you don't want to eat me. But she has no poison or venom. She's totally tricking them. We would know very clearly if she was trying to defend herself. So she would open her mouth very wide and she would stick her tongue out, inflate it a bit, and then she would wiggle it around in the air like blah, 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 like that, being like, look at me, don't eat me.
In addition to using the tongue and making this larger display, they will also exhibit some body characteristics too, right? Flattening out or kind of presenting a different, just like that. And you can imagine that because there is, right, so much, there's all this tissue.
Girth.
And, yeah, all that girth. And so imagine if you were using that, but then putting it in different angles to be bigger.
So if those don't work, she will attempt to run away and hide into a bush, kind of like what she's doing right now. And then she's got this tail that's displayed. That's kind of like her hidden defense. So if something tries to grab her, prevent her from going into a bush, they'll grab her tail and pull, and the tail will come off. And then it has vasoconstriction very quickly. It just stops bleeding, scabs up, heals over, and then regrows itself.
Which is absurd and awesome and amazing. The next individual we are going to look at is an amphibian. Who do we have?
We have Slick the tiger salamander. Aww. He has some pretty obvious defense mechanisms, and that goes with his color here. If you take a look at his color, you'll see that while he can camouflage a bit if he's burrowed down into the dirt, if he is exposed, he has bright colors on him. Bright colors usually are a warning that they're poisonous or venomous. These guys have a poison gland underneath their tail. He would turn his tail sideways and a milky substance would come out of that poison gland, and that would be the poison. And then he'd kind of wiggle around and try and get it on his tail and his body, as much of him as he could, so that not only does he taste terrible, but he will cause quite a bellyache if he's eaten. And now we're going to be talking about some birds. This is Maui and this is Ginger, and they're both green-cheeked conures, also known as green-cheeked parakeets.
So birds, one of the first thing that kind of comes to mind in terms of adaptations or things that just stand out are coloration, right?
Yes, they have the same kind of tone, but one is much darker than the other. And this is Ginger over here. She's the dark one. This is the natural color they would be in the wild. And Maui here, she is what you call a pineapple coloration, and that is human-made. She would not do very well in the wild.
It's interesting to have the color bred, right, for Maui, because when you think about defense, some of the most amazing defenses that we see in the animal kingdom or in life in general is camouflage.
Right.
So the reason why you wouldn't see Maui's coloration just out in the wild is because that camouflage defense has to match the surroundings.
Exactly. So if she was born in the wild, she would basically be a neon sign for predators saying, eat me.
Hello.
So she would not only blend in with the foliage around her, but also the rest in her flock.
Aside from just not being seen, if you are seen, there's then the step 2, right? So if you are seen by a predator, then what?
Flight is huge. Birds have evolved and put so much energy into making this defense work for them. Right. I mean, their entire physiology is geared for them to be able to fly.
And it's kind of that idea that the defense can also be offense if you are a bird that is hunting and actively utilizing flight to come from something from above.
Exactly, yeah. Do you want to show off that adaptation of flight?
Yeah, I would actually love to. What do you think,
Let's go
Ginger?
ahead and do that, yeah.
All right, you are so sweet. Hi, hello. Are you ready? Nice.
There she goes!
And now a word. Not from our sponsors, but from the dictionary. Welcome to this month's Wild Word. Once a month on Nature League, we'll look at the etymology or origin and history of words related to nature. This month's theme is adaptations, so we're going to examine a word that represents one of the most common predator and prey adaptations on Earth. The word is camouflage. Ah, yes, that word that makes you thankful for autocorrect. And it's no wonder. Its not-so-English spelling has to do with its not-so-English language of origin. The word camouflage can actually be traced back to several languages, and the complicated journey camouflage took to get into English is definitely part of why it's so obnoxious to spell. The most recent leg of camouflage's etymological journey was in France. The French word camoufler is a slang term which means to disguise, which is pretty much how we use this word in English. This French word most likely came from the Italian word camouflare, which also means to disguise. However, we still haven't gone back far enough. The Italian camouflare is most likely a combination of two separate Italian words. Capo, which means head, and muffare, which means something similar to muffle or dampen. Capo is derived from the Latin caput, meaning head, so the word goes back even farther. However, it's interesting to note that some topic experts believe that the French word camoufler is itself a reference to the word camoufler, which actually means something along the lines of a slap in the face or a snub. Although the origin of the word is a bit all over the place, the majority of its source words mean something like disguise, and that meaning hasn't changed since entering the English language. It just so happens that the entering the English language bit is one of my favorite things about this word. The word camouflage wasn't used in English until the early 1900s, and one of its first usages is totally fascinating. In the August 1917 edition of Popular Science Monthly, the magazine published a piece that started by mentioning different photographs of British and French war terrain disguises that they'd previously published. The article reads, "Until recently, there was no one word in any language to explain this war trick. Sometimes a whole paragraph was required to explain this military practice. Hereafter, one word, a French word, will save all this needless writing and reading. Camouflage is the new word, and it means fooling the enemy." So while the origins of the word camouflage existed in languages around the world, including French, Italian, and Latin, it took a world war to get it into the English language. And that is pretty wild. During our Biodiversity Month, we talked about invertebrates, which make up the majority of all life on Earth. So we would be remiss if we did not check out some adaptations of an invertebrate.
This is Professor Claw, and she's an emperor scorpion. Everything about her is an adaptation for her to survive, but the biggest one that she needs is defense. And these guys are the second largest scorpion in the world, so they are huge, but because they don't have really intense venom, they need other ways to defend themselves, and so they have adapted the huge claws.
Their sensory is part of the way that they both defend and hunt. It's both defense and offense.
And it's interesting because like their defenses are also their offenses. Like they're all rolled into one. She's not trying to pinch me. She is using her claws to feel this rough terrain. She's like, I'm not sure why it keeps going up and down. And so these guys have kind of terrible eyesight, and their eyes are on top of their carapace there. So in order to figure out what's going on, they put their claws out in front of them. That's going to help make sure that she stays safe wherever she's going. And if she does run into a predator or a piece of food, she can sense it and she can grab it. The hairs on her claws, those aren't real hairs, folks. They are a special part of her exoskeleton. So you could actually more accurately call them a kind of a bristle. This is the home of Kismet, the African crested porcupine. In the wild, I would absolutely be afraid of an animal that looked like this because, I mean, she is giving you all the warnings. She's got the stripes and the pokes, and she even has an auditory warning as well, saying, if you come closer, I'm gonna use these on you. So these guys are up against all the large mammals in Africa, lions and hyenas and leopards. They can actually take these amazing quills and run them through a lion. Right now, it looks like she's wearing a skirt, but when she is on defensive mode, all of these quills, she flexes muscles on her back and her quills come up. And so it looks like her crest goes up, but also she just becomes gigantic. She becomes 3 times her size. Right. And she's also shaking her quills at you, so it's going and it's very intimidating. You can kind of see where her tail would be. It is her tail. And they are white, just clear quills under there, and they have this special adaptation where they're hollow. Right there, and so when she shakes her tail, those hollow ones, they hit together and make that noise.
For something to be hollow right next to something that's used as a complete spear.
Right?
It's so different.
These are the guard hairs, so these are what you see on the top here.
Much more flexible.
Yep, they don't even have they kind of have a pointy tip, but they're not gonna go into anything. Right. This is the danger poke right there.
So you can see the flexibility, there just isn't any.
It's so rigid, and it's thick. These porcupines are different than New World porcupines from South America because they don't have a barbed tip. So they have to have a lot of force behind their poke. so that it embeds and it damages that animal enough to give them a lasting impression, so they don't mess with these guys again.
So as you've seen, all life on Earth is just full of adaptations that have happened either over millions of years or even in the recent past, and they all have to do with surviving and thriving. It's so incredible to get to see them up close, and I would not have been able to do that without having you here and being hosted here at Animal Wonders. So thank you for letting us see these up close and talk about them.
I'm so glad. I mean, I love talking about the animals. I love sharing them, and I just feel privileged to be able to take care of them so that I can share them with others.
Some of the most remarkable adaptations of life on Earth in the 21st century have to do with adapting to an environment filled with humans. We next explored the theme of adaptations in a format called Denatured, where I broke down a popular peer-reviewed journal article on mammal behaviors that are currently changing in response to humans. For this month's Denatured segment, we're going to look at an article released in June 2018 in the journal Science. In this month's lesson plan, we talked about the different ways that organisms adapt to their environments. Most of the adaptations we discussed were physiological, but that's just one type of adaptation. Life on Earth can also adapt to changing environments by changing their actual behavior. In this paper, entitled "The Influence of Human Disturbance on Wildlife Nocturnality," the researchers investigated a very specific behavior: nocturnality. Nocturnality is the state of being nocturnal, meaning that an organism is active mostly during the night once the sun has set. So why investigate what time of day an animal is active? In this particular study, the researchers wanted to know if animals are changing their activity levels throughout the day in response to a very specific factor: human disturbance. So here's what's already known. The expansion of humans across the Earth has majorly impacted the rest of life on Earth. Things like habitat loss, fragmentation, and degradation have been documented as big factors in the current alarming trends of biodiversity extinction. However, animals don't quite have enough time to adapt to things like their homes being rapidly destroyed. This means that a lot of the ways that animals adapt to humans being in their space is actually indirect. For example, several studies have demonstrated that animals will relocate or move around to other areas when humans expand into their territories. This is called spatial avoidance, and we also see this sort of adaptation in a number of predator and prey relationships. Basically, if you don't want to be next to someone, you move. But here's the thing. The human population is getting massive, and we keep expanding to new areas. This means that it's becoming harder and harder for species to avoid us, at least spatially. So if certain species on Earth aren't able to avoid humans in space, what about avoiding us in something like time? This is something called temporal partitioning, and it's when species are active during different times of the day in order to avoid things like competition or predation. In this brand new paper, scientists quantified how wildlife are spending their time in response to human disturbance. To address this phenomenon, the researchers conducted something called a meta-analysis. This is when a study studies a bunch of studies. Hence the whole meta thing. The researchers went through the scientific literature and found studies that recorded the activities of mammals across gradients of human disturbance. They focused on 63 medium and large-bodied mammals from across 6 continents. The goal was to measure the degree of nocturnality in response to human disturbance. To do this, the researchers measured the effect size by calculating a risk ratio. The ratio compared the amount of nighttime activity of species in high human disturbance areas to nighttime activity of species in low human disturbance areas. A positive risk ratio meant a higher amount of nocturnal activity in response to humans, and a negative risk ratio meant reduced nocturnality. So what did they find? Overall, the study found an increase in nocturnality by a factor of 1.36 in higher human disturbance areas or seasons when compared to lower human disturbance areas or seasons. But what's that factor of 1.36 mean in practice? The authors give a great example of this increase in nocturnality in response to humans by reframing this number as a percentage of time spent active during the day. Basically, if a species typically spends 50% of its active time during the day and 50% during the night, an increase by a factor of 1.36 due to human disturbance means that the species now spends 68% of its active time during the night. Overall, there were some interesting nuances in this study design. First of all, there are many different things that fall under the category of human disturbance. To address these options, the authors analyzed a variety of human disturbances with varying degrees of harm to wildlife. These included things like lethal activity, agriculture, development, hiking, and vehicles. One really interesting result of the study is that nocturnality significantly increased in response to all forms of human disturbances that the authors included. The authors also dug a bit deeper into the differences between the mammals they included in the study. They compared nocturnality in response to human disturbances across body sizes and trophic, or food web, levels. In terms of body size, the researchers found that all body sizes responded strongly to human disturbance. However, the largest size class showed a slightly higher response. Similarly, all trophic levels showed responses to human disturbances. Even apex carnivores displayed an increase in nocturnality, which is kind of amazing when you think about it. These are species like lions, kings of their realms. Apex carnivores are used to being at the top of the food chain, and yet this study found that even these creatures are changing their habits to avoid humans. And this trend wasn't just seen in one place or one habitat type. The researchers found an increase in nocturnality in response to humans on all 6 continents they studied and across all types of habitats. So overall, this means that mammals around the world are preferring the nightlife. However, this study was a meta-analysis, meaning that the authors analyzed many different studies, and some of those studies didn't report an increase in nocturnality due to human impact. The authors explained that although they found this lack of increased nocturnal behavior in some studies, this doesn't mean that humans are not impacting the non-human animals around them. There are all sorts of factors that might limit a population from changing its daytime-nighttime activity routine, including differences in age, sex, personality, and food constraints. But overall, the authors found significant increases in nocturnal activity among mammals closer to human disturbances. This led to the question of why. In the last piece of their article, the authors offer one big potential reason for the increase in nocturnality: fear of humans. This article was published in the journal Science, which is highly prestigious. Not only that, but the results made some headlines in the news as well. Here are some reasons why I think this study is capturing both scientists and citizens. For one, the topic is super timely. The extinction rate of species and the expansion of the human population are both currently happening at rapid rates. This means that humans and non-human species are all sort of trying to figure it out, but in super speed. The human population relies upon other species on Earth, but there's a constant conflict for coexistence. The results of this study are important because they quantify for the first time a true shift in behavior worldwide. A smaller result mentioned in the study happens to be a big one in my book, and that's what they found when comparing the effects of lethal versus non-lethal human disturbance. The researchers actually found that non-lethal human disturbances, like hiking and walking, had just as much of an effect on increased nocturnality as lethal human disturbances, like hunting. This finding is fascinating and certainly a big wake-up call for the ways in which we humans view our actions. Basically, we don't have to be actively killing mammals for them to start preferring the night. Our mere existence in their habitat is enough to potentially drive a fundamental change. As with any new piece of research, there are several areas of improvement that exist in this study for follow-up research. My first issue with the study is that it was based on mammals. Not only that, but based on medium to large-size mammals. The problem here is that representation matters. Mammals make up a very small portion of life on Earth, and the largest group of mammals are the rodents, which are smaller. Basically, this means the results aren't completely applicable to the majority of life on Earth. Another spot of contention is that this study was a meta-analysis, meaning that there weren't any new experiments conducted. This means we can only really discuss the correlations between nocturnality and human disturbance and can't talk about the potential for causation. Improvements aside, the part of this paper I absolutely loved was the discussion of applications to ecology and conservation. The authors offer several points of interest. First, if species are able to separate themselves from humans in time, it means that there might be fewer conflicts over space. And if separation is occurring, that can lead to less instances of negative human-wildlife conflicts, like attacks and transmission of disease. On the darker side of things, this shift to nocturnality could mean trouble for these species in terms of the way they adapt over time. It's possible that the shift to nighttime activity could negatively impact crucial things like reproductive success and food web interactions. After all, these species have been evolving traits over millennia that were selected for based on being diurnal, or active during the day. It's hard to all of a sudden start selecting for traits that work in the night. Even though there's a lot of doom and gloom surrounding the topic of humans disturbing wildlife, this study found remarkable levels of adaptations by animal species all over the world to adjust to life in this human-dominated era. To round out the topic of adaptations, I enlisted the help of my good friend Adrian Adams. In this installment of From A to B, Adrian asked me why animals are getting smaller over time. Adrian, what do you have for me today?
Why are pretty much all animals on Earth getting smaller?
So I like how you said that, like, oh, basically like all animals. But do you know that humans are totally getting taller?
So humans are getting taller, sure, but everything else seems to be getting smaller. Take the ocean, for example. The ocean used to be full of stuff that would make people poop their pants, like megalodons,
yes,
woolly mammoths, like now we've got elephants. Mm-hmm. We used to have bronchiosauruses. I'm thinking bronchitis, neck.
A bronchiosaurus is a brachiosaur mixed with a brontosaurus. It does not exist. He's making things up again.
The fact of the matter is that the biggest things on the planet are gone, and we're kind of left with things that are not underwhelming, but definitely not as big as they used to be.
So this whole month has been about adaptations, right? So what are adaptations? in general. Let's think about a working definition.
Things that change physiologically
I like it.
to allow more efficient reproduction and survival.
That works. With cause and effect, though, it's not that the changes are happening to fit something. It's that change just exists in the form of mutation, and then the one that winds up working in the environment is the one that's reproducing more. This is the general concept, right?
Sure.
Mutations aren't happening to fit an environment.
Okay.
It's the fact that mutations exist, so some things are bigger and some things are smaller. In these cases, with the species getting smaller over time, the ones that are smaller are doing better. And so then we have perpetuation of that version of the gene.
Okay.
What would be good about being smaller? Let's think about why it would be an advantageous adaptation.
So the obvious would be so you could hide more easily, right? To me, that's the obvious. But I would argue that unless it's a dramatic and very fast change, I would argue that very small adaptations of size and changes of size would be so nominal and unimportant that it wouldn't make a difference, and it shouldn't make a difference. For example, just because the whatever is that much tinier than that other whatever, that one's not going to be able to hide more efficiently than the slightly bigger one.
You might be right in terms of hiding, but hiding is kind of a higher level thing to do. I think you should think a little more basic. So let's think about the idea of eating. What are you requiring diet-wise if you're smaller? Less. So in environments that might have less food availability, right? If you are consuming less, in terms of calories, in terms of just mass, then maybe it is advantageous to not be eating so much, right?
Are you hinting at something? I don't like this.
You can eat whatever you want.
And I do.
Perfect. But if food were limited, a smaller version might do better. Now let's think about something else. There's pros and cons. There's a really interesting thing about metabolism and body and heat for something like a mammal that produces its own heat. And it has to do with body size and ratio. So as we get smaller, what happens to the ratio of like outsides to insides?
Gets closer?
The outside actually gets bigger, like the ratio. Yeah, kind of interesting, right? So surface area actually increases.
What?
As you get smaller.
What? Surface area doesn't increase as you get smaller? That doesn't make sense. A marble does not have as much surface area as a basketball.
The ratio, my dear. So the volume to the surface area. And so for cells are so small because it maximizes how much the outsides can interact with the environment by not losing the insides. Because as you get bigger, again, that ratio gets smaller and you have less outsides to insides.
Okay. So as the smaller something gets, it can heat itself a little bit better?
It's actually kind of the opposite. So think about heat loss. So if you're something that makes your own heat, right, we call that like an endotherm. So you're making your own metabolism, right? You're not relying on the sun to heat you like maybe a reptile. Okay. You're making your own. If you are smaller, then that ratio of, right, your outsides, you would actually have more heat loss. The whole point here is that there's pros and cons with adaptations. Let's think about some other things when you're smaller, how much space you need. And let's think about the amount of space on Earth with urbanization and some sprawl and habitat availability. So for example, on islands are actually a great example. Island dwarfism is actually what it's called. So you find smaller versions of species on islands, and a lot of that has to do with spatial boundaries.
Oh.
So if we think about the way that we humans are affecting the landscape and kind of making it fragmented, almost like islands, it's possible that that restriction could maybe also be playing a role.
As natural resources continue to be diminished across the planet, do you think the species that will survive in the future are just going to keep getting smaller until every big cat is now the African kitten?
I think it's possible, but I also think that in terms of adaptations, there has to be really intense selective pressure. And we will see how much that pressure exists or doesn't exist in the future in different habitats and environments. It'll depend, but it's certainly something to keep our eye on. And scientists are looking at that right now. There are several teams that do things with body size and metabolism to see how that happens. I mean, we kind of don't know the limit, right? We don't know the mins and the maxes. Humans are getting taller. And in fact, I think there's something like, close to like 10 centimeter growth and average human height in like 150 years. I mean, that's insane.
Yeah.
But it's actually leveling out now. And so we think that there might be that kind of maximum.
Sure.
And for getting small, we know that there's that minimum because of that ratio. So the ratio goods, right? That being said, there are some really cute small things. There's like chameleons that are like an inch long.
Oh! Look at the chameleon.
Concordantly, that's a word, and I'm using it correctly. Why do tiny dogs have such bad attitudes? Chihuahuas, Pomeranians, what is that about? How is that an evolutionary advantage? Like, how did that little tiny chihuahua, its horrible yip, become an advantage? Because all Chihuahuas do it. All Pomeranians are yippers. All the tiny dogs are yips.
They have smaller vocal cords. It's just the sound.
No, but they all the time. All the time.
Separate issue.
Oh,
I'll answer it for you sometime, but I think that one requires a little bit of deeper digging into some behavior issues.
fine. F-Y-N-E. Fine.
Our 5th month was all about adaptations, and we had a ton of fun researching, creating, and filming the content you've seen in this compilation. Thanks so much for watching, and if you'd like to keep going on Life on Earth adventures with us here on Nature League, make sure to go to youtube.com/Nature League, subscribe, and share. Hey guys, to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of Nature League, we made these really cool pins and they're for sale on dftba.com. So if you'd like your own and want to be a part of the Nature League, check out the link in the description. Thanks so much for supporting us.